Hello, everyone. My name is Kramer Reeves. I'm the Vice President of Product Marketing at Sapiens Decision. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar on implementing change in the enterprise with Sapiens Decision. We're going to be talking to you about a number of advances today from a technology, methodology, and best practices perspective, and some of the trends in the financial services industry as well. I'm glad to see so many of you took time from your busy schedules to join, and whether you're watching live or hearing this on the recording later on, thank you for your time. A few housekeeping items before we get started. We have placed the conference in a listen-only mode, but if you want to ask a question, just click on the chat option on the bottom right and type your question into the conference window there, and the organizer will populate that for us to address at the end of the presentation. We have some dedicated time allotted to address some of the questions following the presentation, and the webinar is available as a streamed audio broadcast. If you would like to attend via teleconference, please refer to the session reminder for the global dial-ins. A final reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be available as a rebroadcast following today's presentation. So before we begin, I'd like to take a brief moment to introduce my colleague. Janet Eakes will join us in a few minutes. She is the business owner of the financial services practice for Sapiens Decision. Janet brings 30 years of management and operational experience in the sector to this role, having formerly served as the Chief Operating Officer of the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board and as a Senior Vice President for Mortgage Operations at Freddie Mac, where she worked for 20 years. So why don't we get started? I just want to take a minute to introduce the company. If we can go to the next chart. Sapiens Decision is a wholly owned subsidiary, part of a larger company called Sapiens, provider of global software solutions in the industry, over 150 customers, leading marquee Fortune 500 Global 2000 customers in the financial services space primarily, publicly traded, and with now over 1,400 employees and experts in the space. You can see our revenue from last year, over 150 million, very profitable, and our guidance to the street this year is in the range of 176 to 180 million. Nice growth in the overall company, helping to fund a lot of the investments and innovation in our part of the business, which is in Sapiens Decision. So with that, I want to turn it over to Janet to talk more about the problems, the challenges, the pains that customers are facing in the financial services space with decision management, managing decision logic, and some of the solutions and the approaches that we've developed along with some case studies and some ROI metrics that will be helpful as you are evaluating capabilities and offerings from vendors in the market. So Janet, over to you.
Thank you, Kramer. I also want to welcome everyone to the webinar and thank you for taking the time to learn more about Sapiens Decision. I will be covering the high-level positioning of this solution in the financial institution and then go into some more detail about our product and methodology, into some use cases, and then summarize it at the end. So in terms of setting the stage, let me start by emphasizing that our solution is not targeted at IT, as today IT has very advanced technologies for the development of business systems and the management of business rules, with many commercial rules engines in the market today. Those advanced technologies help IT save money, save time, and reduce risk. Yet, we all are aware of the fact that there are still issues with time to market, risk reduction, and cost effectiveness in the implementation of business systems. That is in large part because the business does not have the comparable advanced technologies for their side of the equation in implementing business systems. That's the ability to discover, define, validate, and manage business logic as a central core and independent asset of the organization. Business logic is found in business policies, in regulations, in operational decisions that must be automated. And yet that business logic is not managed effectively today. It's passed to IT predominantly in the form of business requirements, and those might be in narrative Word documents or in some attempt at organization through Excel documents, but they are imprecise tools that are subject to errors, to conflicts, and to inconsistencies when implemented across an operational platform. It's also very difficult to trace the coded logic in applications or in rules engines back to the business intent. That traceability is very difficult when analyzing change, when analyzing problems or unintended impacts in operations. That's where Sapiens Decision steps in. We are an advanced technology and a methodology for managing business logic organized as business decisions in a separate and governed repository. And this model, decision model logic, is the means by which IT and business align and collaborate quickly, comprehensively, and consistently in the implementation or change of business systems. I'm going to start with a testimonial from one of our clients. It's Freddie Mac. We mentioned that I worked there for a while, so I am well aware of the challenges Freddie Mac had in implementing business change. They now utilize Sapiens Decision as the handoff, as a replacement of business requirements. I want to emphasize replacement to IT, which has greatly sped up the change process. How is that possible? Let me illustrate that. This is the typical system development lifecycle, whether it's an agile sprint approach or a waterfall approach. All change lifecycles start with business scoping and then discovering and analyzing the requirements and authoring the requirements against that scope for what business systems, what products, what channels, what services must be changed or created to satisfy that scope, authoring those requirements, and then going through multiple requirements review and validation sessions with subject matter experts and within IT before the requirements are approved and handed off for development and implementation. And there's always a systems test cycle and an out to UAT for business test cycle. Once implemented, there's ongoing support, audit and compliance, and incident handling operations. And inevitably, the business policy, the rule must change, and we go back through this cycle again, starting by recreating the logic that was implemented, going back to initial requirements, or starting over with the policies and regulations and recreating the requirements, analyzing and trying to ascertain which business systems and what code in business systems or rules engines must change, and going back through the life cycle. That takes a set amount of time and resources. The problems in that process are many. Let's start with requirements. There is no one methodology for writing a business requirement. They're cumbersome, they're lengthy, ambiguous, and incomplete. It's not possible to test business requirements for completeness in an automated fashion for gaps and conflicts. So we have these multiple conversations to make sure we understand what is documented. And then we're never sure we're done. We just simply run out of time and have to move on. Different parts of the organization then come to understand the same logic differently. Business policy changes or regulation changes often cut across business applications, business lines, products, etc. And different analysts, different project teams will write requirements differently, trying to represent the same logic, and then IT might code that differently as we have to stovepipe and break up the project into multiple teams. Peer review of requirements is complex as they're large, poorly organized, and hard to understand. Requirements are not a living asset even if they are in a requirements tool, because they're not normalized, structured, or organized such that they can be versioned and maintained and automated impact assessments and simulations conducted. There's not enough rigor and structure to them to accomplish that. Then we get into UAT, and very often we find misrequirements or misinterpretation of requirements during UAT. And again, it's a long, lengthy, iterative testing cycle to discover them all, invariably run out of time, and have to delay the schedule or descope late in the game when it's very costly. Then we get into production, and here we often have further defects discovered because UAT can't test everything. And we'll end up putting in many manual controls to control for that, to detect them and remediate them, which is costly, or we'll spin off additional phases of the project to correct them. And I've already mentioned you cannot simulate change from a requirements asset and document. You cannot, so we're recreating the logic and recreating test cases to validate logic in UAT. And the descoping of requirements, whether at the beginning or in UAT, and the discovery of defects means that we're going to continue far more manual activities than were initially intended by the business and for which they thought they paid. So all of those problems add up to significant cost to an organization. The lengthy requirements capture and definition is costly. It requires many resources, lots of duplication of effort over projects and over teams and across business lines. Production issues that should have been avoided. Very heavy lifting to assess, do root cause analysis, and correct implementation problems. The ongoing manual heavy lifting to extract existing logic from code in order to analyze it for change, and then the continual descoping of automation. All adds up to slow time to market, high cost of projects, and high cost of error detection and resolution in production. How does Sapiens Decision help the situation? Well, let's look at the impact of developing and managing business logic with Sapiens Decision. First, we're going to collapse and take what requires weeks today and accomplish all of the same activities with higher scope in just days. We are collapsing, discovering, analyzing, then authoring, then reviewing and validating requirements into one step: discover, analyze, review, and test with data verifying the logic and the results of executing the logic in one step with a decision model. What, again, I'll emphasize, what took months takes weeks now. What took weeks takes days. What took days takes hours. It's a significant reduction in time and in the number of resources involved. What is handed off to IT then are these very structured, normalized, tested, and validated decision models, business logic models. They're so structured and normalized, atomic, that you could actually, and we have adapters, can auto-transform the logic directly to code, eliminating manual development. Testing has already taken place, and so we move right into user acceptance testing and find far, far, far fewer problems because we discovered errors in logic and clarified and optimized the logic by actually testing it with data early in the change lifecycle. Now we don't have to recreate that logic when there is a policy change, because we can actually take the logic, identify automatically what is impacted by a policy or regulation change, and then model that change and simulate the impact much, much faster with far fewer resources than in traditional methods. And we can lift our heads up as an organization working across business and IT to now, instead of focusing on fixing problems, let's focus on analyzing the results and improving our policies and getting to the intended business return faster. What is required to accomplish what may seem impossible to believe? What is needed is what Sapiens Decision provides: a model, structured and based on the 15 principles of our decision model, that can be validated, verified, and tested in the design phase by business users, can be implemented easily by IT so that IT has an exact understanding of what is intended by the business, and a means of governing that logic as an asset. And that's exactly what Sapiens Decision provides. So now what were problems and liabilities to the organization become benefits. We have shorter projects, faster implementations. We implement more at a lower cost than is possible in traditional methods, with much, much higher quality. These are aspects of change that organizations following the traditional methods have to trade off. Trade off scope for schedule, for cost, for quality. With Sapiens Decision, those do not have to be traded off any longer. Over a short period of time, an organization will reduce operational errors, penalties, problem resolution costs by 60 to 80%. The cost of implementing a business system, automated rules running in a business system, drop 40 to 60%, and the cost to maintain the system also dropped by 40 to 60%. That adds up quite dramatically over, this is just one business line. You get to tens of millions of dollars in added benefit and a return on investment very quickly. And I'm going to go a little deeper and look at a traditional rules approach. This is a typical requirements document, and as you can see, it's a narrative, even though it's structured in a table. There are many if, ands, thens in each of these statements. It is very hard to know how each of the text descriptions relate to each other. There are multiple objects being acted on and conclusions. There are procedural rules mixed in with business rules, and entropy increases over time, meaning every time you change, it gets more and more convoluted. And in fact, many organizations end up putting in duplicate rules that are in conflict when change occurs, because it's very hard to determine the interdependence among these statements. Here is a decision model. This is an example from an insurance organization trying to determine if a policy can be manually renewed. You can easily see the structure of this in this model of everything that must be considered when determining policy renewal method. Everything, if you can see, there's each one of these shapes represents a business logic model or conclusion. At the top is the ultimate decision, policy renewal method. And we can tell that policy renewal method depends on three things: policy pricing within bounds, policy underwriting risk, and policy manual underwriting indicator. The two conditions that are under the solid line but below the bottom line require additional logic in order to reach the ultimate conclusion. But the condition under the dotted line, policy manual underwriting indicator, does not require further logic. That indicator can be found in persisted data. But for the two conditions that require additional logic, we make those conditions a conclusion of their own logic table, and we drive out the conditions that must be evaluated in order to make an underwriting risk conclusion or pricing within bounds conclusion. For underwriting risk, we see quickly that there are 4 conditions. 2 of those conditions, the values are going to be provided by persisted data. The 2 above the dotted line require additional logic. That means we're going to be able to look down and find what we call these decision tables, rule family tables. For those conditions, we make it a conclusion of a separate decision table, and we drive out everything that must be considered in order to understand ownership change and location change. Now, in these bottom 3 logic tables, you see that every condition is under a dotted line. Every condition value can now be found in persisted data. So we know we've come to the end of the logic. There is no more logic to discover, and this decision model is complete, something you cannot ascertain with business requirements. You can look at every condition under the dotted line and know all of the data, exactly what data must be fetched from the databases in order to determine policy renewal method. Now, each of these tables I mentioned is a separate logic table. So let's look at what that looks like. Here's the very first logic table. We call this the conclusion rule family. To determine policy renewal method, we know we have to consider these 3 conditions. So let's look at the values of those conditions and determine how we draw conclusions. Policy pricing within bounds is a condition, as is policy underwriting risk, as is policy manual underwriting indicator. So these headers are the conditions, and this is the conclusion. In our methodology, it's set out in a different color in the tool. It's policy renewal method. And we read a rule family table, a logic table, by reading each row separately as a separate logic statement. If policy pricing within bounds is yes, and policy underwriting is acceptable, and policy manual underwriting indicator is off, then we can conclude automatic renewal process. Or, and you read, and it's or, going down, rows are ors, or if policy pricing within bounds is no, we're not going to need to consider underwriting risk and underwriting indicator in this time, because just the fact that policy pricing within bounds is no is sufficient to know that we have to do a manual renewal. Or if policy underwriting risk is unacceptable, it's a manual renewal, or if policy manual underwriting indicator is on, it's a manual renewal. This is a complete logic table. There are no other values for these conditions or combination of these conditions needed. We know every scenario in which a policy needs to be automatically renewed or not. Now, we mentioned that above a dotted line, there are conditions that require further logic, and in a rule family table, those conditions are underlined. So let's take policy pricing within bounds. You see now that we've created a supporting rule family where it is now the conclusion. We never have multiple conclusions in one rule family table. Each rule family table represents one and only one conclusion. This one, policy pricing within bounds, is the conclusion, and it depends on policy discount and pricing tier. Pricing tier is found in persisted data, these values, but 1, 1.5, 2, 2.6, but policy discount will require additional logic, therefore, in supporting rule family table. I'm going to read across one. If policy discount is less than or equal to 10%, and policy pricing tier is greater than 1, then policy pricing within bounds is yes. And every other row is an or. Policy discount is a condition that's underlined, meaning additional logic is required, and so here we'll drive out the logic for policy discount. I'll read across the top. If policy grade is D, policy discount is 0. Or if package grade is B and policy grade is in this list of B or C, or that set, then it is, 5%, and so forth. So basically what I just did was went through the total logic, this logic chain from the original decision model. This is all of the logic necessary for determining policy pricing within bounds. These three simple tables anyone can read and understand is the only logic and in our repository, the only versioned and governed, the only source for the logic of policy pricing within bounds. This is another example. I'm not going to go through in as much detail, but this is from the mortgage industry determining loan-to-value compliance. You can see that determining loan-value compliance, if you just look at the graphical model, is a consideration of maximum LTV based on whether it's a purchase, mortgage, refi cash out, or refi no cash out, and the loan purpose determination type. So by determining the loan purpose, by considering the maximum LTV for each of these types in each of these separate rule family tables, we can draw the ultimate conclusion of whether the loan-to-value ratio for any one loan is compliant. We consider if the maximum LTV is greater than 0 and the LTV ratio percent on the loan is less than or equal to the maximum LTV calculated, then we're compliant, otherwise we're not. Maximum LTV is different based on loan purpose, and it's derived through further logic, and so we evaluate loan purpose for each loan. And we have here in 3 tables all of the logic, easy to understand, for how we determine if any particular loan is compliant with our loan-to-value requirement. And we can test it. Each one of these rows is a loan, and this is the data pulled from the database on each loan, and we simply run the logic and determine whether expected result matches the actual result. In one case here highlighted, the expected result was compliant, but we got non-compliant when we executed the logic. Messages are returned based on the logic that provides the exact reason why it was not compliant, Our tool will return the result in the decision model form. So either red is the value, the data associated with the loan, and the resulting conclusion for every interim rural family and interim conclusion necessary to reach the ultimate conclusion. In this case, the maximum LTV ratio percent is 70% for a mortgage purchase transaction with secondary financing secured by a 2 to 4 unit investment property. That message was derived from the logic itself, and that is why this loan at 120% is not compliant. The effect on process is quite dramatic. Here are two versions of the same process, and that is setting a determining a credit rating. We consider employment history and debt and determine if it's A or it has to go to manual underwriting. Option 1 and option 2, the only difference is the first 2 steps. In this one, we look at employment history first and debt second. In the option 2, debt is second and employment history. Debt is first and employment history is second. You know, this is exactly the same process. When there is no dependency on sequence, then the process is flowing logic. It's not flowing activities. When applying our methodology, we simplify business process dramatically. That 4-step process, because those are logic steps and not activities, we're able to collapse into 1 step, determine person's credit rating, and all of the rest is logic modeled in a decision model. And now we take what has become a common practice of incorporating business logic into process flows, and they become unwieldy and impossible to manage. And in this case, 16 versions of them, because there are 16 regions, we simplify it and we create decision-aware, simple. We take complex and make it simple workflow. And everywhere there's a blue octagon, that means there's logic that must be executed. A decision must be made at that step of the process. Those 16 processes, regional processes, became one because the sequence of activity wasn't what was different across those regions. It was the logic. And we can create versions of logic by region, which involves reusing logic and saves lots of time. Quick case study. This is a financial institution who had a product suitability problem. There were no controls for identifying what must be considered, what was considered, leading to specific products being offered to a customer. They needed controls to meet audit requirements in 4 months. The project, when we got involved, had been going for 3 months, created 15,000 rows of logic, they estimated 17,000 in order to be complete, and the business subject matter expert could not sign off because it was too impossible to know if the requirements were complete, there were no conflicts or gaps among them, and what it all added up to. This is an example of what it looked like. 15,000 rules. They've been working for 12 weeks, were not complete with 2 analysts. We stepped in, and with Sapiens Decision, in just 3 weeks, we completed the project. 3 weeks. We created 24 decision models with them, and in those decision models, this is a complete decision model. Across the 24, there were 149 rural families. And 35,000 test cases were generated automatically to verify the completeness and accuracy. So through our methodology of mapping, discovering, and modeling business logic, which is very, very fast, through our tool that ensures the integrity of the models and tests the models with data, we got a 99% improvement in the number of rules being implemented. 15,000 were reduced to 149 rows of logic across the 24 rural families, achieving amazing accuracy. And lowering costs by 30%. And they achieved their ultimate scope and goal. In a mortgage case study, this was in a default asset management area. They had complex, unmanageable processes with too many manual activities and bottlenecks, so they had many backlogs. They could not understand why so many of their modified loans, cured loans, were falling back into default, and they were having lots of non-compliance issues with audits and regulators. So with Sapiens Decision, stepped in and took these horribly complex, unmanageable processes that involved both manual and automated activities, created one simple process, linked the process to business decision models, and eliminated the backlog and achieved much, much higher levels of compliance. So again, through our methodology of creating that logic quickly, validating it, testing it, the backlog was dropped by 80% in 12 weeks. Default management timelines improved by 50% in 12 weeks. Non-compliance issues with downstream investors and regulators dropped, and the severity of each credit loss event dropped. So in summary, what we offer is a business user term where you work in business-friendly visual modeling language on the business. That's typically business analysts who, instead of writing requirements, and SMEs who are reviewing requirements, are now working with models, developing and reviewing models. Maintaining the traceability, because each row of logic is tied to a statement in a policy and a row of code running in an application. We're designing, validating, auto-generating test cases, and what-if analysis in the tool. We have a glossary that defines each of the conditions and conclusions in the logic tables and mapping them to the operational databases. Governance for and workflow for assigning an analyst to develop the models, following workflow for peer review, for subject matter expert review and approver, for deployment and testing as well. Technology agnostic, these decision models hold up and can be implemented in Java applications or any commercial rules engine, and it is very straightforward, converting the logic tables in each row of logic to a row of code, or in a rules engine or an application. So we have adapters that auto-transform the logic to code. IT then takes possession of that transformed logic and tests it and implements it. It saves them much time in manual activities as well. And we have an enterprise-grade platform with a federated glossary, versioning, control, auditing capabilities, and automated impact analysis. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kramer to conduct our Q&A session.
Okay, thank you very much, Janet. That was wonderful. Especially love to hear about lifting our heads up and focusing on delivering the business value that a lot of the business stakeholders expect. And it's always great to see a case study with 99% improvement. That's maybe that's a record. Let's open it up for some Q&A. If you have questions, a reminder just to submit those directly into the chat session, and Janet and I can see those, and we'll read those as they come in. One question, Janet, that came in earlier on, if we take a step back, talk a little bit about some of the drivers here in the space. You know, what are some of the operational and regulatory drivers in financial services that we can expect to see in 2016? Certainly there's been quite a few over the last few years. that financial services companies are still addressing, what else should they be looking out for that might benefit them from considering a decision management platform?
I think the ongoing complexity of the business environment where our clients are expecting to interact with us more and more in an automated fashion, in mobile apps, with products designed specifically for them, with regulators that are requiring us to capture more data and validate the data and manage the suitability to the customers and ensure that all of the operational risks are driven out of our processes, to provide our clients with the disclosures that regulators are now requiring, and to implement change in order to be competitive much faster. Products, services, new capabilities must be implemented at the speed of business. And many of the organizations that are adopting decision management and implementing Sapiens Decision are achieving those goals. Specificity, precision, reducing very complex and large amounts of data into straightforward business decisions. And just the business environment and the regulatory environment mandate that that solutions like Sapiens Decision are put in place as a best practice.
That's good. And speaking of best practices, another question that came in is regarding adoption. Can you talk for a second about what successful adoption looks like for some of the customers we've been working with in the space, those that have deployed and are seeing value? What drives success for them?
Beginning with a project that is business critical, we train a project team or a change team with business analysts, subject matter experts, and IT analysts assigned to it. We train very quickly on how to produce decision logic models instead of requirements, how to reduce complex process to simplified process, and how to associate the two. So on a project that has a critical implementation, critical schedule, aggressive scope, we establish very quickly the means to achieve the business results fully in a shorter amount of time with less resources. And from that base, that first project, we utilize the repository and build on it with additional projects. And the first, you may start with one project, the next round maybe 2 projects, the next round maybe 4 projects, and we keep doubling, building the organizational capability and the logic repository. The efficiencies grow exponentially very quickly with time, and within a year you'll have a best practice in place over multiple projects.
Very well. I think we have time for one more question, and I want to stay on this topic of ROI. You showed a couple of charts here about adoption and how the value is achieved by customers as adoption continues, and certainly as decision logic needs to be changed and altered, the time savings, the speed to market. Can you talk just a little bit further about what drives ROI specifically from the customers you've seen, the ones that have been successful? What's been some of the keys to that success in achieving some of those incredible return on investment numbers you showed earlier?
The return on investment is really very straightforward. calculated savings of time and resources in the implementation of business systems and the changing of those systems. So you'll implement more with less and faster, and that's just a very straightforward cost reduction. Once in production, the number of operational issues drop. The comparison to tomorrow's implementations in terms of the operational errors, root cause analysis, remediations that must take place is another very immediate return on investment. That again is resources and time reduction, but it's also the financial impact of operational errors drop. And then over time, the ability to reuse that logic over products, over channels, to grow the logic repository intentionally from business line to business line, and to create an enterprise logic repository, then magnifies those benefits very quickly as the repository grows and as more and more of the business lines are utilizing decision management.
Okay, that's great. And certainly we can share more information about some of the case studies. You can see our contact information. Feel free to reach out to us directly, and we can provide some more detail. We're about ready to wrap up. I just wanted to remind folks that on January 28th we'll do our next webinar. This is the first in our series for 2016. It will be hosted by Modern Analyst, and it will highlight Barb Van Hale, one of the co-authors of the decision model and an expert and thought leader in the space of relational models and decision models and business rules as well. So she'll talk about how these models are essentially living, and that, as Janet described, we're creating assets that can be managed for the inevitable change that you and your customers are requiring throughout your environments. So join us on January 28th. Janet, thank you very much for your time today. Very informative, and for those out there seeing this on the recording, feel free to reach out to us, or we'll talk to you on January 28th. Thanks, and so long, everyone.